Prigozhin sent a convoy that took over first the southern military district in Russia, and then moved north towards Moscow. And that's a long way. That's 8 hours drive or so. And they were effectively waved through checkpoints. They faced very little resistance. And for Putin, I think this must be really, really troubling, because it suggests, at the very least, that Russia's security services, its armed forces, were at the very least apathetic about Prigozhin coming to the capital to confront the defense minister and the chief of general staff, and by virtue of that, Putin himself.
Yeah, Yevgeny Prigozhin, he's butted heads with military elites in Moscow, particularly over the battle for Bakhmut, in which thousands of Wagner fighters died. What prompted him to make this move?
Well, he's been complaining for a long time about not having access to ammunition, not having access to transport, and particularly more recently that the orders that Wagner troops were being given were sending them off to die like cannon fodder, and he's been increasingly annoyed at the Russian military for that. Now, it seems that the armed forces were given carte blanche to solve the Wagner problem. And according to Prigozhin, one of the Wagner bases got attacked by Russian air power, which prompted him to say, right, that's it, I'm coming to get you. This has been a long time coming, and it has been telegraphed. And it's really, I think, quite extraordinary that no action was taken from the Russian side earlier, when even the United States knew about this in early to mid-June and was planning for contingencies. So once again, I think it points to some real fragility within the Putin regime and his ability to retain control over the state.
I want to talk about Vladimir Putin's future in a moment, but what will Prigozhin's exile in Belarus look like if he makes it there? We haven't heard from him since this deal was struck.
Yes, we simply don't know. He's gone very dark. If he emerges in Minsk, then notionally he will retain some degree of control, one assumes, over Wagner's very extensive operations in Africa. But whether or not he is becomes someone who is, actively involved in politics and decision making for any length of time, we really just don't know. He's probably quite lucky to have survived with his skin for the moment, but that may in fact also not last very long, such is the case with people who challenge authority in Russia.
How damaged is Vladimir Putin? Can his leadership recover? And that strongman reputation that he had is now gone, isn't it, in a nation where weakness is fatal?
Yeah, look, I do think that this is at the very least the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin. He has effectively blinked in the face of Prigozhin driving towards the capital. Previously, anyone who raised even the slightest hostility or disagreement with the president would find themselves in jail, at least in very short order. Now, Putin has said to Prigozhin, okay, well, everything's fine. He goes on TV and says, first of all, that there's going to be a civil war and that traitors need to be liquidated. And then all of a sudden, he says, no, business as usual. And this creates an opportunity, I think, for other elites to say, well, Putin's rule of alternating fear and reward doesn't necessarily have to be like that. People can escape with their skins relatively intact. So it gives the impetus to others to try again. And it's also very, very hard, I think, for Putin to walk back this idea that someone who was venerated as a hero by the Russian media, Prigozhin, can come out and say that the invasion of Ukraine is based on a lie, and yet he gets away with it. So troubling times ahead for Putin, whether it takes days, weeks, months, or even a year. I think the writing is now on the wall for him.
If Vladimir Putin doesn't continue, who could possibly take over, and could it in fact be a worse outcome?
Well, that's really the troubling thing, Karina, is that Putin has set himself up as, the only solution to Russia's problems, surrounding himself with people who, if they were to make it to the Russian presidency, would have real trouble uniting the different clans that Putin has set against each other. and also people who frankly would be worse than Vladimir Putin in a great many respects, from ultranationalists all the way through to imperialists. The list of people who could take over is frankly decidedly grim. It's not like there's a liberal Western intelligentsia in Russia, and there hasn't been for a very, very long time. So unfortunately, it may be more of the same if in fact Putin does go, or potentially a lot worse.
We've had the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese this morning call for Russia to immediately withdraw from Ukraine. What does all of this mean for the conflict in that country?
Well, I think in the short term, it doesn't mean an enormous amount because the Wagner forces were already pulled back off the front lines to regroup. So they weren't taking part in the fighting. But down the track, I think that this does have pretty serious implications for the Russian military because there will inevitably be a purge. Seeking out those people who were friendly to Wagner. And there was a fair bit of that support within the Russian military and also the intelligence services too. They tended to be middle-ranking people who ironically also had the most combat experience. So it may well be that Russia starts purging its best commanders in the middle of a war where it is facing a very robust counteroffensive from Ukraine. And that spells bad news, I think, for their future prospects in that war.